Okay, well, I'll go ahead and introduce everyone. My name is Jill, but thank you so much for joining our ISQOLS webinar. This is in conjunction with the Happiness Alliance. My name is Jill Johnson. I'm the Executive Director for ISQOLS. And also moderating today is Laura Muzikansky. She's the Executive Director for the Happiness Alliance. We're very, very pleased to have our guest speaker, Erin Weber, and I'm going to have Laura introduce her. So thank you again for joining us.
So our guest today is Erin Weber, who works with Evan Preston in Washington, D.C., bringing the concept of quality of life indicators to legislators, to policymakers. And when I heard about that, I was very excited. And but most recently, her organization, USPRIG, which you'll hear about, is looking at bringing the idea of income inequality to Washington, D.C., as well as to other states, which you're going to hear about. So I think that this webinar is particularly timely because March 20th is International Day of Happiness. There was a resolution in 2012 that made March 20th International Day of Happiness, and that resolution came on the heels of this resolution from the UN asking member states to use wider measures of well-being. And International Day of Happiness is supposed to be a day where we reflect on where we are in a use of wider measurements of well-being by nations, governments. Until now, if we look at what's been happening in terms of countries using wider measures of well-being, the United States is lagging quite a bit. In the European Union, every nation is now measuring well-being, and many of the OECD countries are now measuring well-being. So I was very excited to hear about the work that Erin is doing. I think that it's extremely important because she is bringing this concept directly to our national government. So with that, Erin, turn it over to you.
First of all, a huge thank you to ISQOLS for having me on to do this webinar. Thank you to Laura for helping to bring me into this world. This is very new for USPRIG. So my name is Erin Weber. I am the Communications Director for USPRIG's New Economy program, and I am also directing our Working for Wellbeing campaign. And I'm here to talk about a policy that is a campaign designed to spur a broader conversation about happiness and well-being. Where the US is right now, we unfortunately cannot, it is really difficult in this climate to jump directly from GDP to shifting toward well-being. And so we're designing a collection of campaigns that are with that particular goal in mind, that allow us to talk to policymakers at the state and national level about what actually matters to people and how we need to reorient ourselves to align with those values. So quick little bit about USPRIG. We have a 30-year history working on both the federal and state levels. We are a membership-based organization, so a lot of our power comes from the grassroots. We have canvassers out every single day in cities all across the US, and we have offices in, I believe it's 32 states now. So we are using our action from our members to influence state policy, which we also use to influence national policy. And traditionally, our history has been working on consumer issues. And our partner, our sister organization, Environment America, has traditionally only been working on the classic environmental issues. But we noticed as our history played out that there was quite a convergence in a lot of the things that both teams were working on. And thus the New Economy program was born. So we have been there. So I am directing our Working for Wellbeing campaign. And it uses concrete policy conversations to shift the narrative around well-being and how we prioritize quality of life. So our argument is rooted in the difference between the scarcity and post-scarcity paradigms. The scarcity paradigm is the world we lived in for all of human history, where no matter how hard humans worked, there was always a shortage of basic human needs. So lack of food, water, and shelter was common. We spent all of our time trying to keep ourselves sheltered and find food and water. And that's no longer the case. We are now living in a post-scarcity paradigm. So due to industry and innovation, the US now produces enough for everyone. We no longer need to set up our society to chase endless growth because we don't need endless growth to provide for everyone. But the problem is that this new reality flies in the face of the king of US elections, GDP. You can't get through a politician's soundbite or a political debate without someone talking about growth or GDP. But that's actually hurting us. So we produce 1.7 times what the planet can sustain every year. And 1/3 of food in the US is thrown away. So the US pursued GDP because it was the best tool available at the time to measure improvement in our society. And for a time, pursuing it seemed to work. The US, pursuing GDP took us from hunger to having so much food that each of us throws away about a pound of food each day. And increasing GDP improved housing, employment, access to education, and of course, innovation. But going back to the food example, yes, we have enough food for everyone, but hunger is also pervasive. And that is because while we were focusing so much on producing enough for everyone, we weren't orienting ourselves to prepare for this post-scarcity paradigm where we have enough, but it's not getting to everyone. And so we lost ourselves in this process of GDP. And now increasing GDP doesn't mean better life for Americans anymore. You could argue that there was a time it used to, but it hits us in the face every single day with news stories from bribing college officials to get your kid into college, to the fact that hunger is actually rising in this country, that even though our GDP is increasing, quality of life is not. And so more than $500 billion is lost from the US economy because of workplace stress. And more than 80% of doctor visits are due to stress. With a healthcare crisis, that's a big deal. It seems like in our quest for GDP, we've made jobs and production the biggest focus of our lives. And that focus has continued throughout generations to completely reshape our culture and our policies. So on average, the modern American worker spends 181 more hours at work each year than 30 years ago. That might be fine if we're actually doing something that the worker enjoyed. So on average, we know that over half of all Americans report being unhappy at work. So we're not spending more time at work because we all of a sudden are all doing jobs we enjoy. We're doing more work, often for the same pay, because we are still singularly focused on increasing productivity and productivity alone. And this is a problem because it means we're getting sicker and spending less time on what matters most. So our families, our communities, our friends. We're closing ourselves off from each other, and in the singular quest for GDP, we've isolated ourselves from the universal values we all share, and that's about to be an even bigger problem. Automation is rapidly replacing a lot of the work we do. We've already seen this happening in the US. Factories don't need workers anymore. Assembly lines are automated. There are even now automated machines that are bartenders and flipping burgers that are already being introduced to the market. And what's more is that the future of artificial intelligence could upend the entire landscape of jobs people do every day. When you're talking about quality of life, this should all be good news. It should be a good thing that we have the ability to make machines do all of the dangerous and boring work that we've been stuck with in the past. But we have not oriented ourselves toward that future, and shifting toward quality of life is a big piece of preparing for that. When we reorganize ourselves to prioritize quality of life over growth, the future will be a promising beginning rather than a cataclysmic end, which is what it feels like sometimes. But the good news is that there are real policy solutions that, one, prepare us for the future of work in a post-scarcity paradigm, two, improve quality of life, and three, reframe how society defines success. And that's by valuing the work that people are already doing every day. And nowhere is this opportunity more obvious than caregiving. Millions of Americans already serve as unpaid caregivers. 40 million Americans, in fact. They are all ages taking care of a myriad of needs for sick, disabled, and or aging loved ones, of course, children as well. And they often receive little to no help from employers or governments. And so 43% of those unpaid caregivers are also unemployed. So remember that number, because that is really key. Because if a caregiver doesn't have taxable income, they don't qualify for a key government program that has become the current focal point of our campaign in shifting how we talk about well-being and work. That's the Earned Income Tax Credit. The Earned Income Tax Credit, real quick, a few points. There are strict income requirements. So there's a strict income ceiling that is $53,000 for couples, and that number scales back if you have fewer than 3 children. And if you are a single individual, then that number, that ceiling stops at about $15,000 for earned income every year. Filers have to be 25 years old. If you qualify for the federal EITC, that means you probably also qualify for the state EITC, if your state has one. Not all do. And also a key piece of this tax credit is that it's refundable. So it's actual cash in people's pockets that isn't just against their tax burden. They actually get this money. And depending upon how many children you have, it could be thousands of dollars. But the catch is that it requires earned income. As the name says, it's right there in the first 2 words. So if you spend 50 hours a week caring for your mother with Alzheimer's, your father with MS, your child with a learning disability, or just a young child who you're staying home with all day, then you don't qualify unless you also have earned income. So go back to that number, that 43% of unpaid caregivers are unemployed. That makes sense. Caregiving takes a lot of time and energy, and it's not the fault of caregivers if they can't manage to balance that responsibility with the responsibility of a job. And sometimes with erratic doctor's appointments or other difficulties that stem from poverty, that's also just not even an option. So we are running campaigns across the country and at the state level and on the Hill at the federal level to include unpaid caregiving under the definition of work for the Earned Income Tax Credit. And so far, we have had support from senators, governors, and champions in in state houses as well. This is becoming a conversation that a lot of politicians are realizing they need to have. They just didn't have a policy vehicle before to. And it's a big step because it goes beyond a single policy. It's more than just expanding benefits. We're making sure that we message this campaign and talk about it as a fundamental shift in how Americans think about work. And that's a big deal because when it's a big opportunity to talk about prioritizing quality of life in policymaking. Because when we redefine work, we talk about a future in which people from all walks of life are empowered to contribute to their families and communities in ways that improve quality of life. And so they're no longer beholden to the trap of growth, productivity, or just trying to get by with whatever job they can get. They actually have the opportunity to do things in their communities and in their households that better their lives, that better their loved ones' lives, and that better the lives of our communities, states, and ultimately our entire country. So I wanted to leave some time for questions and discussion, so I'm going to stop there. And I guess I'll kick it over to Laura or Jill.
Thank you, Erin. So yeah, this is the time when I can put my camera back on. This is the time when if you have questions, please do ask questions here. You can unmute, you should be able to unmute yourselves, Lorraine and Rima. Jill, did you have a question before?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you. That was really wonderful presentation. And as someone, my mother cares for my ailing grandmother, so I definitely understand that need. I was just wondering, and apologize again, are there any other countries that you have designed this program after, or do a good job of modeling this already that you would think would be a good example?
So that's a really good question. The interesting thing about this particular policy is that it is unique to the US tax code. And the earned income piece is actually a big part of why it's. So this was actually introduced as a very traditional American, anti-poverty, make them work for what they get type of Reagan era anti-poverty decision. And it was actually championed by Reagan. You can talk about his motivations were behind that, but yes, it had bipartisan support. So because of that nature, and we're basically just trying to take it and make a loophole through it. If you're talking just in policy terms and not within the campaign, there isn't really anything we've been able to model, either take from to inform our work or an export to give to other places, because a lot of places already have they already have these social supports in place. They already have this bigger value of quality of life. A lot of other countries that we've looked at are already in the process of shifting away from this singular focus on growth. So this is a very particular fight because the US has such grained cultural norms of, hard work is in and of itself a goal. And, we need to focus on growing GDP, even if it means we're cutting social programs. So I would say it's very particular to the states in the US.
And I think, other countries like many of the Asian countries will have the families live in the home with them. The elderly parents live with the family. So it's more of a familial, generational support that's just part of the culture as well. Whereas here, we tend to have them leave and go to the care centers. But for families that don't have enough money to support that, it becomes a huge burden. So that's interesting. So thank you so much. That's all I have. Lorraine, did you have a question?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Erin. I really enjoyed your talk and the ideas. I'm watching from Canada, so we have a slightly different situation that we're dealing with. But I'm kind of curious. First of all, how do you imagine the income being distributed? Is there an idea that people would actually report how much time they're spending caregiving, and they'd have a salary associated with it? And also, are you imagining it working in some ways with a universal guaranteed income as kind of complementary uh, ways of, I guess it's both recognizing work and also quality of life and time for community, all of that?
Yeah, those are great questions. I love the first question of basically how would this work. I didn't get into that in the presentation, but I am more than happy to talk about it because a lot of the pushback that we've gotten initially is the idea of, oh, well, how do you prove it? And to those people, we would say the same way that any person ever claims a child on their taxes. So the way that the laws that are being introduced have been written is that it basically expands the definition if you are a caregiver for a dependent, and then expands what the definition of a dependent is, so that it's no longer just children, your mother-in-law or your nephew, but they do have to meet certain criteria, and then it would just be the same as claiming a dependent. So it would be just kind of like a box you check when you're doing your taxes. And so then you would just qualify for the EITC, which is already distributed by the government. It's already set up by the government. The amount awarded has already been set. And there are other campaigns that are going on to raise that amount. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of the logistics. And then the UBI question is interesting because this has been talked about in these circles as sort of a baby step toward a UBI. I have my own personal feelings about, I think that in order for a UBI to work somewhere like the US, we need to figure out our healthcare and our education and our housing. But this is a way of really targeting the families who could really use this assistance. But what sets us apart from the other groups who are in our coalitions is really this: we are really more focused on the piece of expanding work, the definition of work.
I love that idea. I think it's fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think what comes up for me is there are some other universal basic income projects that other countries have taken on, but we have yet to find data to identify what are the impacts on the quality of life, happiness, and well-being of people. So if there's an opportunity to gather data for people on this issue, I think it would be really interesting. And we know, that when we look at the data, that people who are underemployed are, they're not as satisfied. And we also know that from the research that's been done, that unemployment, whether or not it's long-term or short-term, has a really big impact on people's well-being. But this question of, what would be the happiness and quality of life or perceived quality of life, well-being levels for people once they started having their work valued, seems to me a really interesting one. I don't know if you've looked at any of that research in terms of identifying the impacts on well-being of these people and using subjective measures of well-being.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I hadn't really even considered that the individual impact. We are looking, sometimes you get so focused at looking at the big picture of we're going to shift this to improve well-being, that the individual pieces of improving well-being can kind of get drowned out by all the noise. I have not found, I've been spending a lot of time in this space, I haven't found any research about what that shift is like just when your work is valued. I think that the closest will probably come within the next 5 years to having any sort of understanding of that is what's happening in Stockton, California right now. Mayor Tubbs is just phenomenal leader, is I believe 29, mayor of a city of 300,000, and he received a grant to start a basic income pilot in Stockton, California, the first one in the US. And I think that that'll be the place where that particular question might not be answered, but we might have data to get a better sense of what it means on an individual level.
Well, that's fascinating. Well, one of our hopes in these webinars is that researchers at ISQOLS will find subjects that are cutting edge and partnerships that are also cutting edge to do this kind of research. So hopefully something like that will emerge from this work that you're doing, Erin.
Yes, if that said, if anyone is interested in working on a project like that, I'm happy to support in any way that I can.
Yeah, beautiful. Any other questions today?
I'm just curious how close we are to, you mentioned there are several senators and governors who are in favor, but what's your projection at this point?
Sure. If I'm being optimistic, which I always try to be, I think it's to work in nonprofits and not take that road. I would say that, so we're focused on, other than the federal level, the states we're focused on right now are California, Washington, Illinois, which has kind of a different version of this bill that is not our wish list, like in California and Washington. And then also we'll be launching in Massachusetts. California, again, if I'm being optimistic, I could see something going through this session for the state income tax there. They have a new governor who's really excited about progressive ideas. Our team has been doing great work there. And also they have a super majority. So that makes things a little bit easier. Washington could happen this year. I think if it doesn't this year, it'll definitely happen next session. Illinois and Massachusetts are a little bit of a different idea. I think the policy in Illinois will get passed, but it's a non-refundable hit for caregivers, so it's not really revolutionary in how it shifts our narrative, but it's still a valuable step toward having a policy in the future. And then Massachusetts, I could see something in the next few years. And on the federal level, we have actually had a bill introduced by Senator Sherrod Brown, and we're looking at, there are a few representatives who are looking at introducing a companion bill into the House. I think that it'll definitely pass the House, I would imagine. The Senate is also a possibility, but then the Trump veto power is always kind of a wild card, and I don't think we would have enough votes to override that. So I would say if it doesn't happen this year, take a look around 2021 once a new president is sworn in, and then we might have a little bit different of a situation. But we're really just excited that the senators and the congressmen and women who are talking about this are sticking to this messaging. They're talking about the future of work, talking about quality of life. They're not just talking about it in terms of caregivers contribute $200 billion to the economy and that should be recognized. We want to break out of that frame. We want to stop talking about dollars and the economy and actually talk about the people. And I feel like they've been doing a great job of getting that message out there.
That's great. Any other?
Thank you.
Any other questions?
No, not for me.
Okay. Right. Rima, did you want to ask a question? Maybe not. It's not required. All right. Well, Erin, do you want to say a few words to close here? I really appreciate the work that you're doing.
I really just want to again thank you, and thank you to Jill. I feel like this has been both just on my own a journey figuring out this space, and then also just for our organization, this is totally new. ISQOLS and Happiness Alliance, you both have been so helpful in helping us navigate this space, and I'm really excited now that we have this policy foothold to keep pushing the conversation so that in 5 years we're talking about shifting from just GDP to also measuring happiness, and how that'll change the lives of Americans everywhere.
Beautiful.